since Xabi Alonso, Real Madrid have actually not been doing that badly. They're pushing for the title, and yet there is huge discontent still amongst fans. What has Álvaro Arbeloa not done right? Is he a keeper or not?
Well, I suppose the biggest thing is that everyone knows he's not going to be a permanent fixture. People aren't talking about him as if he's Real Madrid's Michael Carrick in this way. Or even if you want to go back further, a Vicente Del Bosque figure or someone like that. No one expects him to stay beyond this season. It's fed into a kind of a disconnect in general around Madrid. And from speaking to people with knowledge of that dressing room, they'd say that one of the biggest issues here is, one of Alonso's main problems, look, Alonso was tactically better than Arbeloa by some degree. You can just look at their kind of coaching careers so far. Arbeloa is seen as a little bit of a kind of a Alonso light in that way. But Alonso, one of the reasons it didn't really happen was because, look, there was all sorts of stuff about his relationship with Perez and kind of his attitude to the Club World Cup and the wider Madrid politics. But ultimately, a lot of the squad felt he was cold. There was no connection or link really between him and a lot of the Madrid dressing room. Whereas with Arbeloa, it's not the opposite in terms of effect. It's more the opposite in terms of his approach, where he's seen as someone, whereas basically Alonso absolutely refused to bow to stars. Arbeloa is seen as someone who just, who the total opposite, who will kowtow to the big names in the dressing room. And because of that, it's almost the kind of the other situation then, whereas the players found Alonso cold. With Arbeloa, there's this sense that because he's so willing to bow to them, there's not from what I'm told anyway, there's just not that same authority, and hence he doesn't have command of the situation, and it does feed into this wider noise around Madrid, especially as the identity of the next manager feeds into such kind of doubt and discord around the club.
It sounds from what Miguel's saying that Arbeloa doesn't have the personality that's needed to bring Real Madrid back to where it should be.
I think the problem is the person who did has just walked out the door. That's the issue, really, because Arbeloa as a Real Madrid coach makes a lot of sense. And he's been groomed as a future Real Madrid coach for a very long time. Of course, him and Raul, if we're talking about recent or recent-ish former players, have both been earmarked as potential next Zidanes, the sort of guys who could toe the party line, understand the politics of the club, coach perhaps slightly more lightly than you would at other clubs, and get it done for them. But of course, they made a choice when they brought in Xabi Alonso, and that choice was to change the way that Real Madrid are. After an era in which they've improved the stadium, shed a lot of big contracts, driven down wages to the same degree. This isn't completely a Real Madrid thing, of course. Driving down wages and moving away from, or at least ostensibly moving away from, a completely star-led model is something that Paris Saint-Germain have done, for example. So it's not out of touch or out of keeping with their competitors.
But to be fair, Paris Saint-Germain needed a certain coach or a certain style of coach to be able to grab the club by the horns and drag it into where they wanted it to be, didn't
Sure, and you could argue the same about Real Madrid. I guess the difference is there needs to be will from upstairs to move on from that model of the stars having the power. Now, of course, it's different because the star model has been entrenched at Real Madrid for longer than Paris Saint-Germain have existed. So you're talking about something, and something that has been encouraged and refined and commercialized under two eras of reign by Florentino Perez now. But it just makes no sense, really, the fact that you get someone on board to lead this revolution who's sort of got one foot in the star model, because Xabi Alonso is not at all naive to how Real Madrid operates as a club, and he was one of those players himself, although obviously not the same sort of profile as a Zidane or a Beckham or a Figo or any of or Cristiano Ronaldo or any of those. But to sort of row back from that so quickly I feel like Florentino Perez has really exposed himself quite badly. I feel that's the issue. And you're reminded of it every time Real Madrid have a home game, because you look at the table and you think, okay, this is fine. It's playable. They and Barcelona are miles in front of Atletico Madrid, obviously aided by the fact that Atletico dropped more points last weekend. But there are only two contenders for the title, and we know it. But there are two contenders for the title. You know, I think by the eye test, we look at it and think Barcelona are the best team in Spain. They should be up and away. But the fact is they're only 1 point in front at the moment. And the fact is that since Álvaro Arbeloa took over, they've closed that gap, because it was 4 points before. And it felt like as we discussed with David, that they were hanging on Real Madrid to a 4 point gap rather than looking like they were going to shorten it.
Have they closed that gap impressively? Impressively enough?
No. And I think that's the issue. And like I said, you're reminded of it, Dotun, every time Real Madrid play at home. Because you look at the game they play against Rayo Vallecano, the neighbours who they have far greater resources with. You know, I think outside Spain, a lot of people are probably not even aware that it's a derby like Atletico. And Rayo turn up completely out of nick, and they play in a sense like, yeah, we're not scared of you. You know, that not only could they have got a point out of that game, and it took a goal, a penalty in the 10th minute of stoppage time by Kylian Mbappe to win it, but they really would have deserved it as well. They wouldn't have stolen that point, I think it's fair to say. And the reaction of the crowd at the Bernabeu to the team and to certain players in particular is such, and it's been happening for a long time now. It's like just wins are not going to make those fans at the Bernabeu forget how they feel. And they are letting the players know that all the time. And, you know, to come off the pitch and think we're only 1 point behind a pretty good Barcelona team at the top, and the fans are angry with us, it's not going away anytime soon. That's a huge problem for them.
Yeah, remind us, Miguel, why do the fans of Real Madrid have the hump right now with the team? What have they done?
It comes down to something bigger, doesn't it? It's about identity and what they're here for. I mean, the Spanish league with the two has always been a bit funny in that sense, in that because ultimately they have been the two best paying clubs in world football, they've produced squads of sufficient quality, and this is generally more true of Madrid, who aren't an ideology club, certainly not like Barca. And if you go through this millennium alone, whatever about kind of the most of their history, there's been loads of seasons where suddenly they've won a title when you wouldn't really expect to under a manager you mightn't fully expect, just because they have the best squad. It's not by default, but it is a product of something bigger, kind of what they are as regards kind of assembling stars. I mean, I'm particularly thinking actually of two of the titles around, say, 07-08, and kind of the interregnum between Rijkaard and Guardiola at Barcelona. But obviously from that, I think we'll discuss this actually a little bit in the Milan section with Allegri. But the last 15 years of football has obviously gone in the Barcelona direction. It's about having an ideology, having a coach that fits a style of player, an approach that the club has decided from, that everything fits into that. Madrid have always resisted that, and it has been a dressing room that's empowered individuals. But there have been, it's almost like they've constantly swung back and trying to do similar. And obviously Alonso was supposed to be a key step in this, even though we now know he was pretty much his entire managerial reign, short as it was facing difficulties from the very off. And I think it's something, like, it sounds so simple, but it's actually something very important to fans. It's about identity, what your club actually wants to be, and how it should be more than just a collection of individuals and stars. And they want something they feel they can attach themselves to, because there is, at the moment, my sense from this team, it's very much like, and this is maybe a little bit actually uncharitable to those teams that won the league under Capello and Schuster, but it does have that sort of feel of a collection of players pulling out results, but none of it really being what Madrid fans really want from their club.
And I think the key part of that, the key similarity, Miguel, between then and now, is the fact that they're not really meaningful challenges for the Champions League, which is the whole thing that gives the club their identity. I mean, people around the club say it time and time again. the Champions League is more important to them than La Liga. Now, mathematically, and in actuality, because Barcelona haven't got a huge squad and they're really setting their sights on the Champions League this season. Like, Real Madrid are not the best team in La Liga, but they could win it. You know, and it's not just the points that tell you that, but what might happen. Like, I don't think it takes like a couple of Barcelona injuries or a couple of Barcelona restings if they're really chasing the Champions League and they can get it over the hump this time. And that, of course, they're still in the Copa del Rey. So they're going to play more and they've got less of a squad. It's not completely beyond the realms of possibility at all that Real Madrid, despite not being the best team in this Liga, win it. But if they go out and say the last 16 or the last 8 of the Champions League, Arbeloa is cooked. It doesn't make any difference what they do in the league. And I think, going back to what Miguel was saying about, you know, them always, Barcelona and Real Madrid in this golden era, always having the best players, I don't think you can say that about Real Madrid now. Now, look, they've got a couple of players that do belong certainly amongst the best players in the world, more than a couple of players who do belong in the...
And maybe one or two who really are the best players in the world, maybe.
Yes, but you know what? I don't think a lot of teams look at them, or a lot of their peers at the elite level look at them and think, we're scared of them. And you know what? They don't have... I'm talking about how angry the fans in the stadium are with them. I think part of that is, even when they're at their most harem-scarum in the Zidane years, they were Champions League winners because they found a way. They were almost like a turbocharged Atletico. You know, not in that their defence was perfect, and Atletico's defence hasn't been perfect for a really long time, and that's one of those cliches that tends to linger in European football. But in their way of doing whatever it takes, in their way of hanging on by their fingernails. I mean, do you feel that about this current Madrid side, Miguel? Because I certainly don't.
Well, the biggest thing, and this sort of comes back to the identity question as well, the squad doesn't really make sense. It's a bit of a kind of a mishmash of players in different areas. Clearly, I mean, one of the biggest things with Alonso was he didn't feel he had that midfielder that he needed, and Madrid still lack it. And from that, then there's an element of trying to shoehorn in different players in different positions. Bellingham, as one of the most obvious examples, was a revelation in his first season. Mbappe comes in. I mean, this is a big thing with Madrid, actually. Throughout that era where they kind of restored themselves to win the Champions League in 22 and 24, that came from basically a pretty meticulous and well-planned 6-year project, mostly spearheaded by Juni Calafat, who was empowered by Perez, who was basically, you know, most of their starting 11 in both finals were young players signed under the age of 22, and a lot of them were signed in their teens. So they grew with the team. It was an obvious response to this feeling that Madrid couldn't go out and just sign the best players in the world anymore in this, you know, in this era of state clubs and all of this, as Perez would put it. And then what happens? They get to 2024, they win it again, and Perez wants Mbappe. And as good as Mbappe has been for Madrid in terms of his individual performance, it's pretty obvious he just didn't have a clear role in that team as it was being built.
No, he's made them a worse team, and I don't think it's entirely his fault, but he's definitely made them a worse team. Yeah,
exactly, because it doesn't fit in the same way, and this goes back to this thing of identity as well. Because, you know, if you speak to any top sporting director in football now, the way you build a modern club is basically you decide what you're going to be, decide your ideology, and then everything flows from that, from kind of the players you bring. And a few years ago, Madrid had decided they were going to play 4-3-3 for the future. And it does feel they've deviated from that a bit. And hence now we're in this situation where it is a bit of a, you know, I've used the word disconnect a few times, but it's hard not to see it like that. And that's also why in the Champions League, look, it's Madrid, you can never write them off, all this sort of thing. They don't have the same aura, I feel, as previous years.
And they've got an extra match to play in the Champions League because of their defeat to Benfica.
Yeah, 2.
Yeah, so 2 extra matches.
I mean, that's the ultimate punishment, isn't it? For falling short against Benfica, you have to play Benfica twice again.
Of course, yeah. If not Arbeloa, then, just final question on this. If not Arbeloa, then who? Because you mentioned Raul in this conversation. If somebody gets the identity of the club, you'd have thought it was a former high-profile player like that.
But I think the identity of the club is the problem, really. And by bringing Alonso in, they made it clear that they wanted to make A, more of a Real Madrid brand of football, and B, rein the stars in. And when it mattered, like when I know we keep going back to it, but when Vinny Junior threw his drop when he was brought off in El Clasico, they didn't back Xabi Alonso. And you're undermining not just Alonso, but your whole ideology of where you want to go then. And I think it's very, very hard to get it back from there. And it wasn't just hard for Alonso to get it back, but it's hard for the club to get it back because they're saying, well, actually, we're not really committed to this approach. We're not really committed to this fully bought-in approach. And that's a huge problem that has ramifications not just for Alonso, and not just for Arbeloa, but for the next coach and the coach after that, I think. Now, look, they obviously think that different coaches will come forward at the end of the season, maybe even after the World Cup, though they would hope to appoint before the World Cup, not during the World Cup as they did with Julian Lopetegui, because obviously that was catastrophic and created like a whole, all manner of bad feeling around Real Madrid, to the level to which they weren't used to actually within Spain as well. But I think if you're looking at absolutely elite managers, I think it's Real Madrid's never a difficult sell because it's Real Madrid. But how can they seriously go to someone and say, this is a project and we're going to give you time? Because that is patently proved to not be the case.
Of course, the January transfer window closed with a bang on Monday. There was one particular potential signing that didn't manage to go through, and that was, and surprisingly, I think, because everybody seemed to want this to go through, Jean-Philippe Mateta going to Milan. They wanted him, he wanted to go, Crystal Palace wanted to sell, but it didn't happen. How have they reacted? Because they've actually played now since that January transfer window closed, and it doesn't seem as if, you know, they suffered as a result of not getting Mateta through.
No, it didn't. They won 3-0 at Bologna on Tuesday night. They played the last in this round of Serie A fixtures. So we've got a direct look at how it will affect them. And as you say, the early impression, although I think winning 3-0 at Bologna looks great on paper, particularly after their last couple of seasons. They are in poor nick at the moment, and I think that has to be put into perspective. But Milan dealt with it pretty well. And you know what? I think the reality is, with or without Mateta, they've been really, really good this season. So the issue is really, was Mateta the player to put them over the top to be a genuine contender for this title? So not looking at this specific match where, funnily enough, Miguel, the team that Allegri picked for this, with Nkunku, who they spent a little bit of this window at least testing the waters about could they get rid of him, supported as a sort of second striker by Ruben Loftus-Cheek of all people. Both of them scored, so on paper, as you say, looked great. It was the sort of team, Miguel, that you would have expected Allegri to pick 5 days before the transfer deadline to say, look, here we're really stretched, I need a striker.
Yeah, one of the, what are they called? A political selection.
Yes.
As Jose Mourinho's career would, you know, it's often been accused of having a lot of examples of. And look, I think the thing with Mateta is, we said this on Tuesday on the kind of post-transfer deadline day one, he would have brought maybe 7 to 10 goals. That probably propels you to a further 5 to 10 points maybe, and then you're right in the mix. As it is, the squad is, I think it's an interesting Milan squad. It's good. It's not to the level of Inter's. But I think what this mostly says is it does touch on, I suppose, the impact of Allegri. I think that's all the more interesting. This has parallels with the Madrid situation as well, because yes, we have come through this era where actually coaches like Allegri seemed like they were a little bit part of the past, that everyone wanted ideology managers. Everyone wanted managers that played a specific tactical approach, fit into what a club decided, and went from there. Whereas Allegri's obviously, he is a throwback in that sense. He's very much a win, basically a classic example of someone who goes into the club, sees all the different pieces there, and puts together something that works for him right now. And And I think there is a possibility this is starting to come back, especially as we kind of arrive at this kind of fractured post-Pep world where, you know, best practice ideology isn't necessarily what it was in football. Like things are going in different directions. And within that, there is suddenly a space for Allegri to do what he does really well. And I think we've absolutely seen that in Milan. He's come in there. I have to say, for me, the entire, all this talk and their progress this season, I would put it almost entirely down to the coach.
And by the way, you, Andy, and Miguel were talking about the end of the January transfer window earlier on in the week. And if you would like to listen to what Miguel and Andy had to say, you can find it just below us, wherever you get your podcasts, etc. But having said that, are they in a position to challenge for the title, the Serie A title?
They shouldn't be in terms of what they've got available, as Miguel was saying. I think it's something we've discussed extensively on OTC. Inter have the best squad. They've had the best squad for years, and incremental changes to all the various squads of Serie A has not changed that. However, Inter have a habit of not necessarily winning the big matches, and that goes back to before Christian Chivu, of course. That was a thing sometimes under Simone Inzaghi, and particularly last season where they played 5 Milan derbies and didn't win any of them. I think the other thing is they're going to have a busy calendar. You know, they've gone through in the Coppa Italia this week. They're a team that you expect to play, if not to the end, pretty close to it in the Champions League. They've been a major fixture in the Champions League. And even if the way that the sky fell in on them in the final of the Champions League in Munich against PSG felt like a sort of epochal moment, they've walked away from it relatively unscathed. Inter, they've made the changes to the squad that they needed to. They've got a little bit younger. They've still got plenty of that champion pedigree, and they're still really good. And they've still got key players who are doing it for them. So I think the issue is, I guess, the fact that they really ran out of puff last season towards the end. Inter, the fact that squad that we thought was really well furnished was just a little bit old, and having Marko Arnautovic on the bench was not the answer. And he was, I'm not singling out him particularly, but he was indicative of something. He was indicative of depth that looked better on paper than it did in reality. And you could say the same about Mehdi Taremi, for example, who has now gone to Olympiacos. But there is an advantage in terms of the fixtures for Milan, and specifically the fact that they're not playing midweek. It's massive. It's absolutely, you cannot say how big that is going into the back part of the season. Now, particularly when we're looking at players, say if Loftus-Cheek is going to be, I think he's a contributor rather than a player that's going to be massively influential going into the back end of the season. But you look at his injury record, having midweeks off is helpful to him. I think you look at Niklas Füllkrug, who came on as sub during this and will be more important now they haven't managed to get Mateta over the line. He looked busy in this, could have had a goal or two, and he's been very useful so far. He got that important winner against Lecce, of course, going back a little while. And Füllkrug will contribute between now and the end of the season. He is another one as well, when you look at his injury record, will really benefit from the weeks off. The thing that has worked really well for them, going back to Miguel's point about Allegri, it's a little bit like Antonio Conte coming in, isn't it? Like the fact that when he's come into Juventus and Chelsea and then Napoli, he came into 3 big teams with good squads, with no European football. What does that mean? The most precious thing in modern football, time on the training pitch, which most elite teams do not have. Milan have not made Europe, and they have all that time on the training pitch for Allegri. So we can talk about rest and recovery and all the rest of it. He can drill them so well, and that is something that I think we're still seeing even now, that time that he's been able to spend with the players, which is money in the bank for them.
And even if the Serie A title's a step too far this season for Milan, they've got another challenge, Miguel, which is, will they be one of the 4 teams that get Champions League places.
And it's not a given, is it?
Not at all, because there are 5 out of 4 or 4 out of 5.
Let's see what happens to the coefficients as well. I think the fear in Spain is they're going to lose the 5th space. But yeah, and obviously that's been Allegri's line and all this, that it's just about getting into the Champions League again. It does give them a goal, and also just, I suppose, a tangible sign of progress, whether they win the title or not, or even whether they get close or not. And I think that's been the biggest thing about this. We're like, again, from speaking to people in Serie A, they have surprised people this season. But even that in itself is, I think, just an important marker for where they go next. Essentially, I suppose, there's life again.
There's life again. It sounds as if we'll have them for a while longer. Mateta, is that done now? Is that over? There's no comeback to Mateta, is there? Will they try for him again?
In the summer, they might do. They might do. I think a lot depends on what happens next with his fitness. How does he play? If he plays for Palace again, we'll have to wait and see. And of course, the big question for him, as we said on Tuesday's show, is does he make the World Cup? It would be really cruel if it was snatched away from him. But I think he ends up in Serie A next season. Not necessarily with Milan, but I do think he ends up in Serie A next season.
Yeah, and you and Nicky were talking about the 4 out of 5 conundrum, weren't you?
Yeah, and we were talking about how one absolutely massive club is going to miss the top 4, and a massive club that needs Champions League. So Napoli need to continue their progress of recent years. Juventus need to show they're on the right road under Spalletti. Roma invested in a coach in Gianpiero Gasperini to get them there. One of these massive clubs is going to miss out on it. So it's really Inter +3. I think we have to say, and I think it's typically Allegri when you look at the way his teams play to not say we're in this title race, despite the fact that Fabio Capello is cheerleading out there for them on Italian TV. It's very Allegri to bolt the back door and say, come on, Champions League first.
Borussia Dortmund in the Bundesliga have been confidently, or quietly rather than confidently, making progress when we all thought that the league was over and done and it would go as ever to Bayern Munich. But they've been getting results, and they're getting results, Andy, at a time when Bayern Munich are maybe not struggling, but finding it very difficult to get the 3 points over the line.
Yeah, I mean, like very much, there's part of me that thinks that very much like the end of the league stage in last season's Champions League, in the first stage of the new formatting, I do wonder if the Bundesliga is currently creating the illusion of competition rather than competition itself. And those last couple of weeks have been really helpful to that. The fact that against eminently beatable opposition in Augsburg and Hamburg, Bayern have dropped points for the first time. It's been a massive, massive shock. Actually, anyone can lose a game. So it was a huge shock them losing to Augsburg at home. But then that they went away to Hamburg, a team who they always beat up on. They always stick a load of goals past. And they couldn't get it over the line against them. And, Hamburg didn't steal that point in the 2-2 draw. So it's remarkable, really, that has been the case. And then, if there are people thinking in the back of their mind, okay, Dortmund after their game against Heidenheim, where they win 3-2 against the bottom team on Sunday, you think, okay, what is the gap now? And you have to look at the table to refresh yourself because you've kind of written off the title race in your mind. And you're like, oh, it's only 6 points. But you still don't dare to think, maybe we've got a title race here. And Nico Schlotterbeck, captain of Dortmund, comes out after the Heidenheim game and says, yeah, we've been talking about it in the dressing room. We want to be in the title race. We're going for it. We've said, come on, lads, we're going for it. And you're looking at him and you're looking at the game that you've just watched where they really crawl past a Heidenheim team that are definitely going down. There's no doubt about it. And you think, are you mad? Really? Really? After a performance like that, you want to say you're title contenders. But I guess, really, this has been the whole thing of the Niko Kovac era. If your stomach's left rumbling a little bit, in terms of the style that Dortmund have done things in, the results, really, there's not that much arguing. I only lost 1 game all season in the Bundesliga.
Although, Miguel, we should say, firstly, in Bayern's defence, as Harry Kane reminded us at the beginning of the season, they've got quite a small squad and they are operating on several fronts, not Champions League front. Is this an opportunity then for a challenger to come along in the Bundesliga?
I think it's an illusion. Sorry to kill it. I think it's just look when you stand back, especially if we are talking about squad depth, because even Bayern's squad depth has to be put in the context of where German football is now. And I know again, people don't like these sort of discussions brought up, but like it is in 2026 for Dortmund to actually win a league off Bayern is close to a miracle. Just the financial gap is too big. That has manifested in other ways. Look, I'm possibly a bit influenced here because I've seen both teams live this season in Europe. Bayern, I thought their ceiling is really high. I think they're potential Champions League winners if they can get to the latter stages with their squad fairly intact and having weathered weathered a bit more of a congested calendar. I saw Dortmund against Spurs and they were dreadful. Look, and some of that I think has to be put in the context of the new Champions League group stage. It does take the temperature down in some of these fixtures. Dortmund are not going to approach a game like that like they would an actual knockout. But even still, it was just so far off the level. It was such a pedestrian display that has been reflected in some of their Bundesliga games. And I think this is just this. I don't want to say a freak, but where they are in the table and the fact they've only lost one game is a little bit of a coincidence, it's a bit circumstantial, maybe rather, instead of a product of a team that can actually mount a proper title challenge. Look, maybe I'll clip this up at the end of the season and everyone will be laughing at me, but I think Dortmund will end up well off it.
There you have Miguel pouring cold water on, bringing everything back to reality, really, that as much as all the others can huff and puff and chase Bayern, they're a long way behind. What do Dortmund then have to do to really stand a chance?
I think really that the discussion around Bayern and Dortmund and the title is maybe not that different to Inter and Milan and the title. Now, of course, this is different because we see Inter and Milan of clubs of similar levels. There's not quite the financial disparity, although Inter have, obviously had far better players in recent years, and that they've spent largely quite sensibly, which Milan have tried to do. They've not always got it right in the market, and a lot of that has been to do with, briefly going back to them, the way things upstairs have changed so much, and there's not been a consistency of approach. But I think the interesting thing really is a board level in Bayern and Dortmund. The fact that Bayern have got back to a place where they are functioning upstairs again, which I think is very important for them overall, not just in terms of the Bundesliga, because even when things were a bit of a mess upstairs, they could still win the league, clearly, and the financial disparity is a huge part
They could win the Bundesliga, but not the Champions League.
Yeah, they were falling short, and part of that was defensive recruitment, which is funny because Vincent Kompany's done a lot, as we've said in the past, to sort out their defence, which has massively let them down in those two games against Augsburg and Hamburg. But look, I think what we've got at Dortmund is something different, because there's been a power shift there with Hans-Joachim Watzke stepping aside, with Lars Ricken coming to the fore, with Sebastian Kehl still being there, but no one really knowing if he's there for the long term. And a lot of Dortmund's issues in recent seasons have been because there's been no consistency of approach in recruitment, and they've not been smart enough in the market. Now, of course, when they had far lesser means in the early years of Klopp, what enabled them to take advantage of Bayern not being their best? And with the financial gap, it always has to be about taking advantage of Bayern's slips. So whether there will be enough Bayern slips and whether they're in the position to do that this season, we'll wait and see. It still feels like a bit of a long leap to me. But, you have to be near perfect and hope for a Bayern fallow spell. there are some conditions, as you were saying, in terms of Bayern having a smaller squad. And, Harry Kane did say to us at the start of the season, it's one of the smallest squads I've been in. Remember, he's come from Tottenham, not an absolute European elite club. So that was an interesting thing for him to say. And although they've done some interesting business around the margins, they've not really been out there and done anything big. And I think if you look at where Dortmund are, they're not far along enough in making themselves smart again. That's the issue. So even if Bayern have a packed calendar, even if Bayern have a relatively small squad, I don't think Dortmund are quite honed enough to get there now. Now, remember the last time they nearly won the league, that was because it was a pretty lousy Bayern that were title winners that year, and they needed Dortmund to drop the ball inside of the finishing line. That is not going to be the case this time. Bayern, whatever happens, whatever the injuries are, however stretched the squad is, we saw when the squad was stretched last season, they will be able to get past that. In the Champions League, maybe that will have an effect, but not in terms of the Bundesliga. And the problem is that Niko Kovac, I know people are very unexcited about the football a lot of the time. I don't think Dortmund can care about that. He's absolutely the right guy. And the reason they're all in on him at the moment is because of this. They know he can consistently produce the results while there are still problems, while he's sorting out recruitment mistakes of the past. Now, I think Dortmund will be in a better position to provide a coherent challenge next season, because you can see the direction that, I'm not saying they can win it next season, but you look at the direction that Kovac is taking them in, the fact that they're getting younger, the fact that some of these old, highly paid guys like Emre Can and Niklas Zula are going to get off the books in the summer. I think all of that really matters, and they need to recruit a bit smarter. But like I said, on paper, the fact that Bayern have this small squad, the fact that it's only 6 points now, the fact that you've got the Klassiker at the end of the month and Dortmund are at home, well, look, if they can keep the gap to 6 points going into that Klassiker, that'll be really exciting at least. Then if Dortmund win it, then we're maybe talking about something else on the other side. But it feels like a bit of a leap of faith for the moment.
Yeah, this is a good moment to reflect on the Game of the Week selections that our experts offered us last week. We always ask Andy and our other experts to come up with a Game of the Week selection for us to enjoy over the weekend. And last week, Andy, you picked, staying with Germany in the Bundesliga, Hamburg versus Bayern.
Yeah, and I was expecting a sort of goal avalanche. I wasn't expecting it to be evenly split at all. And Hamburg, who are making, of course, they're still fighting against relegation, but they're making a really decent fist, I think, bearing in mind their means of their first season back up. Luka Vuskovic, the player on loan from Spurs, who's only 18, but a phenomenal leader, and people talking about him a lot in Germany. Of course, Spurs got themselves a great asset there, scoring the equaliser from a header. Vincent Kompany at the end, moaning about refereeing decisions that Bayern didn't get in terms of a couple of potential penalties. I mean, I think if you're Merlin Polzin, the Hamburg coach, and you're sitting there thinking, Kompany, because they sit next to each other, the two coaches, when they do their post-match press conference in Germany, which is an interesting dynamic anyway. And he's sat next, 3 foot away from Kompany, going, "You're moaning about refereeing decisions against us. We must have been good."
Indeed. And talking of goal fest, there were just as many goals in JJ's choice, Miguel. He went for Monaco versus Rennes, 2-2 Hamburg versus Bayern. But I think the goals weren't equally shared out in the Monaco versus Rennes one.
Which obviously puts a different complexion on it.
Indeed. 4-0 to Monaco. I don't know if you saw any of it, but clearly that was a one-sided match, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, maybe a bit of a surprise at the extent, but yeah, I mean, it's you have also 4 goals, as in the other game, but nowhere near the same dynamic.